So this paper out of which I'm pulling this, I co-authored with Pavitra Sundar, who's a colleague at Hamilton College. And we were both, in some ways this is a deeply personal sort of project because this was our television moment when television first entered our homes. And we were struck by the fact that the 1980s are widely remembered as the time of television in a place like India. And even if you just take a casual glimpse at YouTube collections, Facebook pages, blogs and so on, television programs from this period emerge as a really rich set of imaginative resources for remembering life in urban India at the time. Now, largely nostalgic in nature, these references to iconography, to advertisements, programs that were aired on the state-run Doordarshan, it was the broadcast network, they suggested an affective charge that was distinct to this period's newly forged middle class. But there's been a relative lack of attention to this formative period within studies of media in South Asia more generally, but certainly in relation to television in the 1980s, or cinema for that matter, really. There's very little work on this period, even though it really is foundational both politically and culturally in all sorts of ways. The years between the emergency, which was roughly from June 1975 to March 1977, when all civil liberties and rights were suspended, and the introduction of structural reforms in 1991, that period involved a number of dramatic and enduring shifts in Indian political and social life. And within that period, media and broadcast TV in particular played a really crucial role in remaking ties between the state, the market, and the urban middle classes. So what Pavitra and I are trying to do is to say, can we go back to this period? Can we revisit it and see if we can develop a slightly different argument, one that doesn't just rehash an ideology critique argument about urban middle classes being hailed into a certain model of consumerism. I mean, we've been through those arguments. Is there something else to be said from this point in time about television history and media history in general? And so what we argue is that this is crucial because television played a role in mediating a profound temporal shift. It delinked the time of everyday life from status notions of development and aligned it with the emergent yet powerful affective regimes of advertising and consumption. The challenge facing the state, in other words, was to reimagine the experience of the present as one that was not overdetermined by discourses of nation building and progress, wherein citizens were asked to embrace scarcity and sacrifice in the present so as to ensure a secure future for the nation. Instead, citizens were to take pleasure in and value the now. And of course, the resonance with the very first panel of today is evident, and I was really thrilled to see some of the ads that Christina was showing, for example. So to try and work this out, we decided to call, not sure what's going on here, decided to call the 1980s the time of television. It's remarkable. This is how the state-run television network worked. It would go off, it would come on, it had a mind of its own. Seems quite appropriate. I'll keep reading while you go with that. Right, so two arguments, right? That the particular communicative affordances of broadcast television and the gradual development of production logics, programming schedules, crucially, and diverse genres over the course of the 1980s reshaped the middle class's lived experience and understanding of time. And second, that by centering the quotidian aspects of middle class life in urban India, Doordarshan's family sitcoms in particular rendered the emergent middle class in different aspects of its daily life, work, family, notions of leisure and pleasure, as unremarkable, relatable, and crucially desirable. So one of the things we want to do is think about this cartoon that appeared in 1983 by Ajit Ninan called Breakfast TV. And I'll just going to jump in and do what William said we need to do, which is do close textualist sort of readings of these sorts of things. The television set here is at the heart of the morning rush to get to school and work. So powerful a temporal force is television that it holds the entire family, including the dog, in the now, in its now, in television's now. The parents and children stare at the television in varying states of undress and in the middle of various incomplete tasks, from shaving to eating breakfast to putting on school uniforms. While Ninan's cartoon clearly shows television reigning supreme over this interior domestic space, it undoes any easy association of the medium with femininity. Because here, the man looks away from a shaving mirror and up at the television screen in order to fashion his body into an impossible position. The woman is also distracted from such stereotypically feminine tasks as cooking and combing her daughter's hair. Even such urgent matters as the hot iron burning a hole in a shirt and the smoke billowing from the kitchen stove, images in the foreground and the background, go unnoticed by everyone in this family. In the middle of these competing pulls on the present sits the triumphant television, beaming an image of a man in a contorted yoga position. It is 7:20 in the morning. Notice the clock up there. But no one's eyes are on the clock, at least not anymore. Mounted on the wall just above the television set, the device is a reminder of just how closely the time of everyday life, clock time itself, is aligned with that of television. Meanwhile, newspaper, that older technology of time and nation, lies unopened on the floor. The presence of the clock and the newspaper in this scene suggests that technologies do not simply disappear in the time of television, they take on a new role, reminding us, and this is sort of echoing Paddy Scannell's work, of what programs are to be broadcast and when, i.e., when is it time to turn on the television set. Ninan's incisive rendition of a middle-class household's breakfast routine gestures to the ways in which television reorganized the spatial geographies of everyday life in 1980s India. Domestic space was newly oriented towards the television, shifting gender and generational dynamics within middle-class households. Television's aspiration to render space anew is enshrined in the very name of the national broadcaster, Dur meaning distant, Darshan meaning vision. And indeed, spatiality has shaped our understanding of television and other media forms across the post-colonial world. And as Purnima Mankekar points out, implicit in terms like flow and dissemination, spatiality remains the dominant trope, including in paradigms like Stuart Hall's classic encoding and decoding, and more generally in conceptions of circuits and circulations of media. But cartoons like this make it clear that television had a powerful impact on our experience of time. It is, among other things, the ordinariness of this scene, its familiarity to middle-class television audiences, who likely started each morning in this manner, that makes it so funny. A trade press article from the same year suggests that this image is spot on, both in its broad brushstrokes as well as in such minor details as the abandoned newspaper. The author writes, quote, "You wake up to the humdrum telecast of breakfast TV. Choosing between the telly and the newspaper, many opt for the former. Evenings are reserved for latest serials, film songs, feature films, and what have you. If you visit a friend at this time, it's assumed you've come over to watch the serial. And if you're expecting a visitor, you're wasting your time." In other words, television's structuring effect on the rhythms and routines of ordinary daily life had a profound impact on the emergent middle class's experience of the present. So if this is one temporal dimension that was dramatically transformed by the introduction of television at this point in time, the other, of course, was the ordinariness of production becoming a thing. In other words, television producers at this time didn't know what it took to produce a sitcom that would be delivered to the state broadcaster on a routine week-by-week basis. People didn't know what it meant to write for television. Camera setups were new. There were no television studio spaces. So often in these early sitcoms, they would shoot in film space, studio spaces, which meant you would see vague shadows hanging over because of the height of the studio spaces. Or that sound would often bounce off in all sorts of uncomfortable ways. The sound design was something they had to figure out in the first place. So there's an entire sort of apparatus of production in relation to the dailiness of television that was put in place during this moment that essentially became the foundation on which Star TV and other global players come in and begin to capitalize on. So if you think about Curtin's idea of the trajectories of creative migration that make certain media capitals emerge as global media capitals, well, what are the histories? This is one small piece of that history within the South Asian context, where without this kind of trajectory of creative migration from film slowly into documentary, into television, and finally into global television, this is the story that hasn't quite been narrated. Off it goes again. So sitcoms then play a really crucial role, in part because of their focus on articulating the time of everyday life as valuable in and of itself. So unlike the melodramatic soap operas where the weight of, say, partition history or the weight of family trajectories weigh heavily, sort of this is a Seinfeld-esque sort of things move on from one week to the next. So there's one particular clip that if I can manage to play, about a sitcom, the very first sitcom, broadcast in 1984, at least the very first domestically produced sitcom. So this was the first locally produced sitcom coming on the heels of various imports from Germany, Britain, all over the US, I Love Lucy, Samoa, and so on. Much of this trio, there's three of them, Venu, Ranjit, and Raja, they're married, and their unemployed brother lives with them. Their time is spent on quotidian activities, quarrels between the husband and wife, consultations with neighbors, concerns over pregnancy, penny pinching for a new cooking range, the purchase of a sofa cum bed that is the envy of their neighbors, and so on. And this particular musical montage that opens does not just emphasize the present, it focuses on enjoying the present. In the first shot of the song sequence, Ranjit and Renu hurriedly cross the street on their way to work, but the rest of the sequence has them doing fun stuff. Ranjit mistakenly rides off on his motorbike without his pillion rider. Ranjit cons Raja of his ice cream. The trio take a camel ride and are stuck walking like camels afterwards as they eat chana spiced gram on a street bench. A policeman shoos them off and takes over the bench for a nap. And the montage at the end of the show uses the same melody and refrain, but depicts other kinds of humorous moments. And the song sequence takes the very specific routines of work and leisure of the middle class and makes them stand in for life in general. The way this group spends their time, rushing to work, taking camel rides, and the ups and downs they encounter in their everyday lives are completely rendered natural. Such is life, the song's lyrics assert. A little sweet, a little tart, a little spicy, a little bland. In other words, although what we see on the show is the quotidian life of the middle class, that very specific way of organizing and experiencing time comes to represent life itself in a sort of an early moment of globalization in 1980s India. Remember, this is when also by 1994, when Indira Gandhi is assassinated and her son Rajiv Gandhi comes to power, this is the moment when for the first time he attempts and he tries to introduce a set of economic reforms, fails, and that gets going in 1991. But he does do some crucial moves, including putting together a group of close ministers and advisors, including a diasporic businessman called Sam Pitroda, who transforms the telecommunications infrastructure in the Indian context and sets in motion not just the emergence of transnational television broadcasting, but begins to open the door for digital and internet-related transformations in 1991, when VSNL, the state-run internet provider, offers dial-up services by 1995. So CDOT is the Center for Development of Telecommunications. All of that begins around this time in 1984. So this generalizing move is key to reimagining the nation's experience of the present, wresting it from the tropes of scarcity, saving, and progress, and future-oriented temporality of development. And together, the themes and episodic structure of this sort of sitcom urges viewers to value the present for what it is, not for what it means in some distant utopian future. So the 1980s, and specifically 1984, I want to argue as a turning point, has to be understood as the time of television, and it wasn't a mere harbinger of economic reforms and cultural globalization. Changes that took place throughout the long 1980s were foundational to the idea of India as a global nation that gained currency in later years and the centrality and established the centrality of the middle class in that new imaginary. Stop there.
And what I thought I would do are two things. Begin with giving some context to what I'm going to be talking about, and then showing three brief clips. I hope I have the time. Please interrupt me if I don't. So I'm talking about 1985. So globally, what happened in 1985? A variety of interesting things. CDs were introduced in 1985. Windows 1.0 was released. That's the year of We Are the World. I'm like, really? You start doing something like this and looking at dates, and your sort of whole temporal frame collapses on itself. Interestingly, in terms of this discussion, in the US, the two most successful movies in 1985 were Out of Africa, that got the Academy Award for Best Pictures, and Back to the Future, that got the highest receipts. So in terms of spatiality and temporality, I thought that was interesting to mention too. More to the point, in Lebanon proper, the early to mid 80s were the bloodiest period in the country's history, period, in its entire history, which, as some historians will tell you, goes way back into the past. A few things that matter. The channel that I'm discussing is a very peculiar channel. It was started by a Christian nationalist militia in Lebanon. The head of this militia, basically what happened is, throughout the late 70s and the early 1980s, there were 5 or 6 sort of Christian militias on various positions on the ideological spectrum that were quote-unquote united or unified by one leader into what was called the Lebanese Forces, which is a Christian national militia. And by unification, basically imagine a bad episode of The Sopranos. Hundreds of corpses for a few years until there was a sort of a unified command and an almost regularized army with tanks and a media apparatus. Now what's interesting, that man was elected president of Lebanon and assassinated about 45 days into his administration. Of course, and still being fought out on both Lebanese and Arab channels. You still see it on talk shows, whether he was a hero or a traitor. He was a hero because he was one of these sort of an early populist who promised institutional work, let the institutions work as opposed to individuals, who created very clear demarcations between the elite and the people, and between the Lebanese and the outsiders. He was a traitor for others because a lot of people feel he became president on the back of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and occupation of parts of Beirut in the early 80s. The bottom line is that unleashed a couple of years of intense bloodshed. Americans know about the bombing of the US Embassy, the bombing of Marine barracks. 250 Marines died in Beirut on one day in 1983. And then in 1985, a couple of months after Israeli forces withdrew from the part of Beirut that they occupied and most of South Lebanon, the Lebanese Broadcasting Corporation started broadcasting. Now, it started broadcasting like all militias. It hijacked an old teacher's college 2 blocks away from where I lived and started broadcasting. The signal was so weak that this was not a very loved militia. If you live under militia rule, even if you approve ideologically, and most people, I would say, or at least half the people did not approve, you tend to resent practices of daily control very quickly. My best friend's father, who was a broadcast engineer, managed in about 6 months into this to mount an antenna in his backyard and broadcast a porn movie in prime time. And for 3 or 4 blocks around their transmitter, that's what people saw. So to tell you how sort of do-it-yourself amateurish it was at the beginning. Now, within a few months, though, this was the most watched channel in Lebanon. And within 5 or 6 years, it was not only the most watched, but was very dominant. In 1996, so 11 years after its launch, it went on satellite, and within 2 years became the most watched Pan-Arab channel for a few years until it was displaced. But so to me, there's an interesting paradox and a question to be asked, which is how can a channel that began as a propaganda voice of a very small sort of radical Christian nationalist militia in Lebanon become the leading source, particularly of entertainment and to some extent news for a while, to a Pan-Arab audience that's predominantly Muslim, that predominantly does not share the ideological outlook of this militia. And that's the question. So there are a few things here that I want to mention also. In terms of thinking about this conceptually, the launch of LBC is sort of suspended halfway between a decade where, first Herb Schiller published Communication and Cultural Domination, the book, not the article, and Arjuna Padurai published his famous Disjuncture and Difference piece. And here we have a channel that is a hyper-local channel, as I will show in the videos, making very explicit and very aggressive to the point of being comical claims to the global, right? So what happened to the channel is, as it became popular, its first move to internationalize was in 1992 to launch what is called LBCI. I stands for international, which was both an attempt to capitalize on the huge Lebanese diaspora from Australia to Africa to North America. The Lebanese diaspora is larger than the population of Lebanon itself, so it's a really considerable audience. That was the sort of explicit and public explanation. The less known explanation is that by creating another company and give it another name, you can evacuate the assets of the first company, put them in the name of the second company that you register in your wife's name, and therefore be able to control so that it's no longer officially belonging to the militia. And that's what happened. So we see a very strong impetus away from being a spokes or a voice to a political party to being a money-making machine that's owned individually. Now, from the very beginning, starting in 1985, LBC's bosses made a very important decision, which was, okay, we're a Christian nationalist channel, but we need to make money to be sustainable. And that was quite revolutionary in 1985. In Lebanon alone, you had 150 TV channels. You can watch anything, any political ideology, any religious affiliation, any kind of aesthetic you can imagine from anywhere in the world. Basically, if you had $50,000, and in a war economy, a lot of people do have $50,000, you can start your own TV channel. Now, they decided very early on they're going to target a Muslim audience. And so here's a Christian nationalist channel doing special Ramadan programming from year one, from 1985. And so on and so forth. So the imperative to be a money-making machine was very strong from the very beginning. What I'm going to show now are 3 clips. One of them celebrates LBCI, the, let's see how, I'm looking, okay, I found them, yeah. So this is let me show you this, and then we can talk some more. Nothing's showing? So these are station IDs. I'll comment the important lyrics at the end in summary form. So this is about the darkness of the war, which is both figurative and literal. We didn't have electricity very often. And this is the sun of LBC. So this was a joke. I was in school back then. Try not to laugh too hard. It's an interesting text once you see beyond it. So here's very explicit. The channel begins traveling all over the place, right? Notice that a sort of a stylized version of the Lebanese flag is everywhere. You have the logo of the channel. This is the very first Arab channel to have used a 3-name acronym, sort of American style, LBC, which was a very conscious decision. The singing is in the vernacular Lebanese. This is not standard modern Arabic or any shape or form. So, they had a good budget. They really did go. So as this proceeds, a few background notes for the next one coming up. So the war in Lebanon ends officially in 1990. There's apparently a document of national reconciliation, though a lot of people still haven't heard about it. And in 1994, there was an audiovisual media law, the very first law in the region focused explicitly on television and radio, that made LBC one of 4 legal channels. So this was a pirate channel, technically, until 1994. In the meantime, as I said, it has achieved such popularity that they found out, for example, that people in the Gulf, particularly in Saudi Arabia, were pirating their signal because they wanted to watch it. And so what they did, as soon as they became legal, they started paperwork going to go transnational. They signed a lease with Arabsat, which is the Arab Satellite Organization, and went on satellite in 1996. So the next two clips I'm going to show are two clips about the satellite launch that I think tell us a lot about the cultural and political compromises that an institution sees itself making when it moves from the local to the regional and the global and makes that claim. So this is a lot of what I'm saying. So this is back in Lebanon at the Temple of Bacchus, which is an old Roman temple. The joke was that if they could go to the moon, they would have gone. Let me show the next video. So these are two, and this is where it gets really interesting. So a couple of things about LBC. It became known for its commodification of the body, particularly women's bodies. In sort of colloquial Arabic in some countries, LBC means put your clothes on. And so there was a lot of controversy that I've written about in terms of music videos, in terms of reality TV. Basically, they showed skin more than you would even see here in the US. And I argue that this is a very deliberate strategy. What you're going to see now are two very different clips about the satellite launch, which you begin seeing the commodification of different identities. So this is the first. So this is called O Traveler. It's talking to a traveler. It's personalizing the journey of LBC onto the personality of a man who's traveling outside of Lebanon, which is a very common story in Lebanon. And there's a lot of sort of bemoaning that a lot of young people leave. And then you'll see what happens. So he's saying goodbye, he's packing. There were very few of these cars left in 1996, by the way. So here, he leaves the Beirut airport, lands in Dubai. So this is about, what it means. They basically make the story of LBC having to acquire a pan-Arab identity successful in the Gulf countries to the sacrifices that a man has to execute by leaving, by traveling. In other words, there's always something to be lost as you gain this new destination. So what the lyrics say here, so space and satellite are basically the same word in reference to broadcasting. It's talking about, look at what appeared in space, the obliteration of travel, the obliteration of distance, the sort of increased proximity between peoples, the whole sort of celebration of globalization at a pan-Arab scale. And here we see it, the camera panning back and forth from Lebanon to the most stereotypical pictures from Lebanon to the most stereotypical pictures of the Gulf.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to see you all here. It's amazing to be part of this amazing lineup, and thanks to Aswin and Co for arranging this amazing event. So today I'm going to talk about 2003, the year that Queer Eye goes global. And this project focuses on the transnational spread of the television show Queer Eye, from its debut on the US cable channel Bravo in 2003 to its reboot in 2018 on Netflix. This work in progress is part of my larger project on sexual mobilities. Here I look at different contexts, spaces, institutions, and technologies to understand not only how ideas about sexuality move, but how mobility itself constitutes sexuality. So sexuality isn't a pre-existing thing that gets shifted around like boxes on a truck, but rather movement and its capitalization are fundamental to what we understand as sexuality. Part of this project on sexual mobilities involves investigating how the changing conditions of global television have shaped the distribution and reception of gay and occasionally lesbian, very rarely bisexual, transgender, and gender non-binary representations. This presentation follows my previous research on the first iteration of Queer Eye, which was distributed on Bravo from 2003 to 2007. Today, I will look both at how the first run of the show was distributed and received outside the US, and how the current Netflix version has circulated transnationally. So first, in what ways did already established television industry practices for global distribution facilitate the circulation of Queer Eye in 2003, and again, through different channels in 2018? And Amanda's amazing work on cable and the internet's really been informative here. And second, what can Queer Eye tell us about the relationships among increasingly transnational flows of television, LGBT content, and social media? I've been working with two research assistants, one fluent in Chinese, Fangwei Chao, who I believe is here, thank you, and another who's been working in Spanish, Stefan Fior. And we've been looking at press articles and social media about the show, two iterations of the show, in China and Spain. This study is not intended to be a comprehensive analysis of how Queer Eye spread internationally, but of how the show was received in two very different distribution contexts. My argument here is that when we think of turning points in global media, we need to think about the relationships between the temporal and the spatial distribution and redistribution, relationships that become more complex with social media and unofficial distribution channels. The circulation of queer media in particular offers an interesting point of analysis because of different countries' uneven conditions of LGBTQ visibility and LGBTQ audiences' often intense investments in finding representations of people like them. I chose 2003 as a turning point in global queer media because of the debut and transnational flows of Queer Eye. But the year 2003 becomes more emphatic in 2018 with the Queer Eye reboot on Netflix for at least the following reasons: new strategies of global TV distribution, social media, the phenomenon of the reboot, and the use of LGBTQ representations to distinguish channels at a moment of such abundant content. So, what's the story? So 2003 was a big year for gay civil rights in the US, including the Supreme Court overturned laws against sodomy, Massachusetts passed a gay marriage law, as did Canada, and the Episcopalian Church ordained the first openly gay bishop. On US TV, gay characters were still scarce, but they were becoming established. So Ellen DeGeneres had come out both as an actor and a character in 1997. Will and Grace premiered the next year, 1998, and this show was still on in 2003. And Queer as Folk brought the word queer into the television vocabulary in 2002 for upscale audiences of Showtime, at least. In terms of the industrial context of TV, this was the height of the reality television boom. Reality television had also proven to be extremely adaptable to transnational format sales. Successful shows could be franchised to other places, allowing local producers to insert their own hosts, participants, and production personnel. For example, The Sun never set on the Idol format, and so the blue areas here are where countries had their own version of the show, and the green ones was where countries collaborated to produce a regional show. So the timing was perfect for Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. The show featured 5 gay men, experts in fashion, grooming, food, decor, and culture. It was, and you can tell who's who then. They have their props. It was important because it showed gay men in charge. They were 5 very different characters and styles of gender performance, and they were real people, not fictional characters. And the show had immediate success in the US. Some of us will remember those years. It brought Bravo record ratings. There was press coverage in all of the major newspapers, and a lot of it. There were books and CDs and other kinds of merchandise spin-offs. And the show won an Emmy in 2004 for Outstanding Reality Program. And it was successful internationally too. The Bravo US version of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy was licensed to more than 30 countries, and local versions of the format were produced in Australia, France, Britain, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain. So in Spain, the terrestrial channel A3 brought the rights to the Queer Eye format from its US production company and produced El Equipo Hey, or the G Team, a riff on the A Team, a show title more circumspect than its US equivalent. The G Team mirrored the roles and routines of the US show, with hosts as experts in interior design, grooming, culture, food, and fashion. And the Spanish press were excited about transforming what they called the Iberian macho into a sophisticated metrosexual, but later noted that the show was, in one article, what they called a resounding failure, and it was cancelled after 6 episodes. So this was the Spanish remake of the American format. The following year, in 2005, the Spanish subscription channel Cosmo, which was targeted specifically towards women, licensed and dubbed the original US version of Queer Eye, titled Operación Hey, or Operation G. Bravo's original dual-casting strategy to women and gay men here was replaced by an explicit appeal to women, with one Spanish commentator noting later, in 2014, it appears that at the time it was inconceivable that a heterosexual man would watch the didactic parts of the show. In terms of the Chinese context, Hong Kong's terrestrial TV station TVP Pearl and a few of their TV stations that were located in the Chinese mainland in the neighboring province of Guangdong broadcast Bravo's Queer Eye, but there was no other official distribution in China. Nevertheless, elsewhere in China, viewers could watch it between 2003 and 2009 on Tudao.com, which was a popular video sharing website. And this version has 166 reviews on Douban, the Chinese version of Rotten Tomatoes, about half of which were written before the new Netflix version came out. And reviews are largely positive, getting a rating of 8.5 out of 10. So this brings us to the 2018 reboot of Queer Eye on Netflix, with 2 seasons in 2018, they've already aired, and a 3rd scheduled for 2019. So the context, so this is the new Fab 5 for the new season, if you haven't seen it. So what context did this version of the show enter into? So on television in the US, the contemporary environment shows a massive increase in LGBTQ characters since 2007, when the previous version had gone off the air. Many of these shows have international distribution through complex licensing deals, as well as through international portals such as Netflix and Amazon. And interestingly, Queer Eye is Netflix's only original reality series. Obviously, they have a ton of fictional stuff, but this is the only reality one. And even though reality television is on the wane in general, Queer Eye on Netflix is part of the reboot phenomenon. Reboots as being a way to cut through the clutter with a recognizable brand.
So thanks, another really great panel. And it's intriguing how all of you have dealt the specificities of distribution. I assume yours is a broadcasting model, and which is terrific in terms of the normalization of a class position. And the Queer Eye story is all about, in some ways, about algorithms. I mean, micro-targeting, and the economics of that kind of micro-targeting wouldn't have really worked in the cable-only era. And your story about cable leads me to like a really dumb question, but how does that play out in Saudi Arabia? I thought women, this is like cultural naivete out the wazoo, but I thought it was like a veiled culture, and these displays of public displays of like what looks to me like fairly Western behavior, is that, how does that work?
So I've written a lot about that. I'll send you, there's one thing that I think encapsulates this. The argument is LBC's business model was based on the hypervisibility of the female form, shall we put it, while the social order in Saudi Arabia is based on its invisibility, at least until very recently, and even then, that's not a can I want to open. But so it created a lot of scandals. But one of the arguments that I and other people have made is that, in fact, what you see here is a sort of a business model that's almost a management of controversy. Right? Let's create a controversy. Let's see how far we can push it. Because every few years, again, there would be, there was one case, a TV talk show. I wrote a piece about it with a colleague that Catherine published when she was editing Critical Studies in Media Communication, with this guy who was bragging about his sexual exploits online in Saudi Arabia on this Lebanese show on LBC, and how basically every time LBC makes money and becomes more popular, until now there was the final reaction, which is that's it, it's a Saudi company. So now you don't hear about this at all anymore, right? And what's interesting is now the Crown Prince is taking all these notions of entertainment that's sexy but not too sexy as a pillar of his political vision for the country. I find that very interesting.
I have a question for Ashwin. I thought what you're doing here is very interesting if you also keep in mind, the kind of scholarship that has emerged around cinema in India, where initially you had this vision that early cinema was about devotionals and etc., and then you come to, stunt films, etc. And it seems like, if you look at Arvind Rajagopal's work, it would seem like 89 or Ramayana and Mahabharata is what is defining Indian television. So I like this shifting of the temporal form. But I'm also wondering whether you could make connections with cinema, especially with sitcom, given that middle cinema at this time is sharing personnel as well as themes.
Answer?
So very quickly, I'm wondering what you mentioned at the end. So for a long time, there's this sort of the global versus the local. That texts that are unwelcome for a variety of reasons can become controversial. I'm wondering, and I guess this is a question for everybody on the panel, but specifically Catherine, like in this case, I can see this being repackaged in Saudi Arabia as a fashion show, and the scenes that could indicate something else would be cut. There would like a few seconds here, a few seconds there. But I'm wondering, like, have you encountered anything, the algorithmic curation stuff? So they're there, but they're invisible. How is that to be understood in terms of the relationship between the local and the global? Like, suddenly there's a huge wrinkle in this whole theoretical construction.
I don't really know how that works yet. I haven't delved into that part of it. It was just it kind of struck me that this idea that everything's everywhere now, but it actually isn't, because if your Netflix feed isn't like pushing it upwards, the really weird thing, just a personal anecdote, is that Netflix didn't push it up to me. And you'd think, I'm sort of a professional lesbian television watcher, and you'd think that I would be, it would be right at the top of my list, but maybe I've been watching too much of The Crown.
Oh, come on.
Same target market. No, so I actually don't know how this works internationally, and so I do want to go back and talk to Stefan about how that works in Spain. Like, do his gay friends, have they all seen it in their, sort of pushed to the top of their list, or, and then also my other question is, how much does Netflix rely upon social media to actually do some of that kind of work for them? So, I mean, these are questions right now rather than things that I can answer.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the larger piece of the puzzle here. So what Salma was referring to is this intense period of a different mode and a different form of filmmaking altogether in the Indian context, beginning in the late 70s, going well into sort of around this time, 83, 84, and then sort of phasing away, which was partly state funded. There was some distribution mechanism that the state tried to put in place, and it was marked by this incredibly closed world of urban middle class professionals for whom the political anxieties that were unfolding in the city at large had to be kept at bay. Now, whether or not how you read that, what kind of ideological critique you bring to that is a different matter. But what's interesting is that it is that cast of characters, actors, but crucially writers, who end up producing the early sitcoms. And what's interesting here is the link to certain socialist and communist histories, because some of the writers of not just this show, but a series of so-called everyday, banal, ordinary life shows, started a production company that they call Iskra, after Lenin's newspaper called Iskra from 1908, I think, in Russia, which of course was started in exile. So there's this whole utopian sort of imaginary that was pulled into these production into the culture of production, and these writers are very much involved with that. So it's this complex sort of intermedial sort of moment out of which television then puts a very specific sort of take on it. And this is where I think scheduling becomes so important. So when somebody like, when scholars make arguments about the broadcast of mythologicals and how that completely reshapes the political public sphere, I want to say, but hang on a minute. About 1 hour before those when those mythologicals were broadcast, I was watching He-Man. Okay, half an hour after He-Man ended was this German show called Fido Dido, this sort of a funniest home video type thing. In other words, the sort of the entangled temporalities of different world genres, which is why I titled this presentation "The Global Times of State Television." That entanglements of those different times are so crucial to keep in mind before we make these large arguments about any particular sort of form or any particular medium and its relationship to an entire sort of national shift from one regime to another, from development to global or whatever that might be. So how you put I Love Lucy into the same sort of day as the Mahabharata and then make an argument about the political public sphere is anybody's guess. But all I'm saying is, we've got to stop doing that. Let's revisit these key sort of phases and then try and uncover, what were the many different transnational forces acting in this one space, including deep histories like Iskra. I'd love to sort of dig into why they named it Iskra in the first place, and then sort of explore how that might have shaped the writing and the production.
Ask the question, but I do. This is a different point, but maybe one of the things that came up in all three was this way in which, and this is sort of the way neoliberalism elicits a certain kind of distancing from politics. I mean, this is all familiar, and in all three, the middle class family, it's all about right, not paying attention to the anxiety, the first Queer Eye, not political. So the commodification, the neoliberal moment, keeping the politics at bay, and I mean we are out of the neoliberal moment. I mean, right? I mean we're in major pushback on that, and we get politics coming back in. So I was wondering if, since that's not really, it's a comment. So, but if you can reflect on that at all, if you see other ways in which media and capitalism are trying to make money out of new populist. Connecting back to some things that were talked about this morning.
I mean, what I didn't really spend a lot of time doing for this presentation was looking at the text. I mean, I've watched all the episodes, but I haven't really done the kind of deep textual analysis that I'm hoping to do on this. And one of the things that's been interesting for me, though, is, this role. So they've decided to go into the South, and a lot of the men that they're making over are very politically different from them. I mean, there's one episode in which somebody has a Make America Great Again hat and things like that. So it's really expressly about dialogue across gaps. And one of the things that, and I've had some really interesting conversations with friends and students about this, where, and it's really about the ways in which the show is expecting these gay men to do a particular form of emotional labor. And particularly, there's a particularly sort of controversial episode in which they get stopped by the cops and while they're driving, and the African American host is driving and he doesn't have his license because he's like, why do I need a license? I'm recording a television show, and it turns out all to be a hoax, but there was a lot of discussion about the show, including an interview with Karamo, the host, that he was extremely upset about what had happened. He felt like he'd really been set up, which they all were, but he particularly. And, concern about expecting these gay men for whom the history of acceptance is extremely uneven and recent, going into what are actually, fairly emotionally risky situations in some cases, and expecting them to do that kind of work. So that's sort of as far as I've got with, that the kind of the repersonalization of politics and the ways in which these shows are kind of are a proxy for something that we hope is somehow culturally going to happen. But people are actually doing that work, that's sort of as far as I've got.
I'll just add one very quick note that, and I'm acutely aware of the lack of work in, say, regional contexts within large nation spaces. Padma Chirumamala, is Padma still here? Back there, has pointed out that even when these mythologicals in in the dominant Hindi language were being broadcast, the communities that she was working in a, say, television repair shop could care less. They were watching all kinds of material, all kinds of content on video cassettes that were being streamed locally in local cable networks, that sort of thing. So I think more regional but then trans-regional accounts of these are so crucial, because there's more to be said about Tamil and Sri Lankan back and forth between film and television than there is with what I just showed you. So in a sense, without that kind of proper, careful historical work into the regional, we stand on very shaky ground when it comes to making claims about national to global.
I don't agree that the neoliberal moment has passed. I think it depends on how you define neoliberalism. If you define it as sort of the open borders regime that we've had, yes, it has passed. But if you define it as the withdrawal of the state from people's lives, if you define it as the commodification of daily life, it hasn't. I mentioned Saudi Arabia, for example. Saudi Arabia only this year announced the cutting of subsidies to some basic foodstuffs, for example. Saudi Arabia is creating a city where it's going to give robots citizenship. It's like it's an almost surreal stage, but this is the neoliberal project continuing, right? I don't want to over argue this point, but I think there are parts of the world that never embraced the neoliberal projects and are only now doing it for their specific agendas. And I think we're going to see this. When do we have the first white nationalist sitcom in the U.S.? When is that going to happen? What's the market for that? I bet you some people are already thinking about this. That's part of neoliberalism, right? So, right? So. No. Well, I don't know.
Well, on that.
It does not sound like anarchy. All right, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel for a great